Hello, Artist Cadet! Welcome to Background Bootcamp. I am PerryPictures and I will be your drill instructor for this course, of which there are 3 difficulty levels, easy, medium, and hard. Do I make myself clear?
Aye, Captain!
Great, because in this video we are going to take it to that next level, aka medium difficulty, better known as intermediate mode. In this lesson, we will expand upon what we learned in easy mode and develop new skills to tackle more thorough backgrounds. If you haven't already watched easy mode and would like to before continuing this level, I will put a video card in the corner to it now. With that out of the way, let's get started.
Ma'am, yes ma'am!
Like I already mentioned, we will be reusing some of the fundamentals we learned in easy mode and build on top of them, starting here with this druid's totem, which will serve as an affixed prop in this drawing, and I have chosen to multiply and flip it so that I actually have 2 in this background. In easy mode, it is very common to draw the character first and then put in a design element or 2 to imply a background. For example, like how I used a Photoshop brush of a tree and stamped it twice on this knife fighting drawing to imply this scene takes place in the woods at night. In intermediate mode, getting away with adding a background after the fact becomes less common, and planning out your environments before drawing your characters becomes more common. Hard or complex mode requires careful planning in advance every time, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. In this example, I do get away with making it up as I go, so after adding an affixed prop to my setting, I then created a skyline and hand drew in some trees in the midground on par with the druid's summoned bears. This has, in effect, established the differential between an easy and medium difficulty background because we now have a midground in between our foreground and background. But before we move on, I also want to point out the use of a gradient on the ground that goes from dark to light the further away from the foreground it gets, and the use of a drop shadow for the characters as well as a top layer to add texture and atmosphere. There are a lot of methods for laying out your background, and for intermediate backgrounds, blocking in shapes, almost like placeholders for the foreground, midground, and background sections, helps to establish depth. Just like thumbnailing, zooming out and roughing in those shapes helps to see the full composition at a glance when placing design elements and testing out ideas without investing a lot of time into the detailed line work before you commit to a composition. Going into this piece, I also knew that the specs I'm working in are specific to a storybook spread, so I have to be careful that I do not draw any of the important information in the center, since that would get lost in the crease of the book's spine. In addition to looking at the spread as 2 halves, I've also partitioned it into thirds. The benefit to this placement is distributing elements in a visually pleasing way on the canvas that keeps the eye moving across the page. My horizontal thirds in this drawing delineate the background, midground, and foreground. My vertical thirds on the left of page focuses on the background characters gathered around the well. Middle third focus on my main character, carefully placed so as not to fall in the crease of the spine. And the right side third shows the narrative action, where I've placed the character handing out invitations. The order I've placed all of these elements in is deliberate for the sake of storytelling, and we will get more into that later. But another tip that can really solidify the physicality of objects in your scene is to have characters or animals interacting with them. Having a character standing next to or in front of a tree or bench is not as convincing as a character touching a tree or sitting on a bench. Characters interacting with their surroundings adds credibility to your setting. This well looks less like an island unto itself because of the characters leaning on and interacting with it. In acting, this is called giving your characters business. The script tells the actor what to say and where, in the kitchen, for example, but the delivery of the lines can look very staged if the character doesn't have a purpose for being in that setting. It looks better and more believable when the character sits on the counter while talking, starts doing or putting away dishes, putting away groceries in the pantry, or raiding the fridge for snacks. These interactions make the space more tangible when the character has a reason for being there. Giving a character business for being in the background works the same way when you are doing your drawings. Now, back on the topic of treating your background like another layer of storytelling, whether it's for a storybook, comic, cover art, poster, or illustration. The first degree is choosing a setting that makes sense for your character and/or the story, but the second degree is using that setting to show don't tell parts of your story. Just like with character design and how the clothing can inform who they are or what the backstory is, your background art works the same way, if you want it to. The well in this drawing tells us a lot about the community and the kind of technology they have where our character lives. And to come full circle, what I would call the third degree of storytelling with your background goes back to the composition and where on the rule of thirds I deliberately put each element. We can do the same thing here on this drawing, so let's take a look. First and foremost, this is another spread, so part of designing this background is being cognizant of the end use for this artwork, and it's always better to plan for that up front than on the back end. So I highly recommend keeping that in mind when you dive into all of your work. Being mindful of the center of the spread and the crease of the print, I divided this composition with a tree in the center foreground. I know the narrative for my story is that a young witch is on her way to be invited to the Midsummer Magic Festival that takes place at night around a bonfire in the woods. That means first degree storytelling for this image requires an environment embedded in the woods. To that effect, I have drafted a cottage in the woods with a cobblestone path. And when you are creating your artwork, you are likely establishing your backgrounds the same way, reflecting on that first degree. But let's push it a little further. Let's go ahead and level up. The second degree of storytelling is show, don't tell. You're actually receiving these two storybook pages out of order in this video, but rather than write on the page that the little witch left her cottage to go into town, I show her leaving her home and going somewhere in one static drawing. The character's pose has a lot to do with that movement, but so does the background. Because of the winding path moving away from her cottage in the background and advancing forward into the foreground, we can tell she is going somewhere compared to this pose on a plain white background, which could just as easily be seen as her jumping into the air as it would seem she is skipping off somewhere. And once we zoom out and add her to the scene, you'll be able to tell exactly what I mean. The third degree of storytelling is about composition and why specific elements work better in specific places. Rule of thirds breaks this spread vertically from left, center to right, and horizontally from background, midground to foreground. We also read left to right, so the elements in my background I use to help me tell my story are being deliberately introduced from the left to the right, background to foreground. My background starts the story on the top left page at the main character's house. We follow the road away from her house to the bottom right page where we meet our character and see the narrative action taking place in this scene, which on this page is her skipping away from her house, and on the other page, the narrative action was the boy handing out invitations, but both are taking place in the same area. Even though I've satisfied all the storytelling needs for my background, it's not complete yet. At this stage, all the visual weight is leaning to the right, so I went back in on the left and added a few hedges and a pond to help balance out the piece. This is where I pulled up a reference, and if I haven't mentioned it yet already, let me just take a moment to highly recommend you use references as much as possible because our mental visual libraries can only hold so much. I pulled up this reference to look at how to draw the pond plans, and the comic I am referencing is an older drawing of mine that I drew over a base that was generously shared by a DeviantArt artist named Seraphic Nayin, and I'll put a link to her DeviantArt page in the description down below just in case you want to check them out for yourself. The next tip I have for creating depth in your intermediate backgrounds is to build up layers, like how I did here with the bushes overlapping and erasing part of the road. This helps to create distance and appears to sit on a three-dimensional plane instead of sinking down a 2D page. Speaking of planes and dimensions, for each example in this video, I used the eyeballing/winging it technique for the perspective, and these backgrounds are way more conducive with that method because each of them takes place in a very organic setting. That is no accident. Perspective gets a little bit harder when you're working with more industrial settings, which is something I am saving for the next video in this series, aka complex mode. With all of that said, I am still going to employ a lot of those easy mode techniques on this intermediate background, like using a gradient for my sky right over my skyline and just going through here and erasing everything that's not skyline, and pushing all of my shadows away from my light source, which we now know is up here in the top right corner because that's where I put the yellowing from the sun. and coloring the rest per usual, which if you are interested in watching a coloring tutorial, I've got you covered and will link both my digital coloring and digital shading videos in the description down below. I really hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If so, let me know you liked it by hitting the thumbs up button, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I am creating new art and animation on my channel all the time, a lot of which are tutorials just like this one. That's it, cadet. You've graduated intermediate mode. I'll see you over in complex.